thick morning fog of April 20th, 1945 smelled not just of spring, but of a heavy, oily mixture of burnt rubber, Saxon soil softened by endless rains, and acrid gun grease. The commander of the Second Army of the Polish Army, General Karol Świerczewski, stood by the open window of the old manor, which served as a temporary headquarters, and nervously clicked the hinged lid of a massive silver watch. The gilded hands were frozen at 6:30 in the morning. To the complete end of the global European confrontation, it seemed there were literally only a few days left, and the air itself was permeated with this unbearably tense expectation of the final chord. In the staff rooms hung thick, bluish smoke from cheap tobacco, mixing with the aroma of strong coffee and a faint but distinct smell of alcohol. It was rumored that the general in those days sought the truth at the bottom of a glass much more often than in operational reports. The historical finale already seemed written, approved in the highest offices of the Kremlin in Berlin, and the victors, it seemed, only had to solemnly, to triumphant marches, enter the ruins of the enemy capital. But it was at this very moment that from the gray, absolutely impenetrable haze of fog on the southern flank, angular, predatory silhouettes of German heavy machines began to slowly emerge, like mechanical ghosts. Few noticed that in these pre-dawn hours, not just the fate of a separate local clash was decided, but one of the most cynical, cold, and carefully disguised dramas of that era was unfolding. Here we see not just a tactical blunder, but a fundamental, tectonic miscalculation that official historiography has for decades tried to disguise as a tragic accident or unforeseen circumstances. But before we delve into this detailed audit of a grand fiasco, lift the secrecy from archival pages, and dissect the anatomy of the catastrophe, I suggest you help develop this channel. Subscribe to updates, like, and share this video with friends so that the hidden truth finds its way to those who are used to thinking for themselves. The spring of 1945 was literally permeated with the intoxicating, almost insane euphoria of the coming triumph. Soviet fronts, like gigantic, unstoppable steel pincers, inexorably tightened the ring around Berlin. In this colossal chess game, where the entire future world order was at stake, the Second Army of the Polish Army performed a task that on paper looked routine and almost auxiliary: to secure the left flank of the main forces rushing to the very heart of the enemy. Historians are still fiercely debating the reasons for what happened next, but I propose to look not at dry columns of numbers, but at the logistics and deeply deformed psychology of the high command. The official version adamantly insists the blame lies solely with poor intelligence work and a desperate, unpredictable strike by the army group under Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. However, it is here that I must state my first serious doubt about this smooth official version. Think for a second. Could the complex, well-oiled system of frontline intelligence, honed by years of bloody battles with squadrons of aerial reconnaissance and a dense network of agents, have allowed such a total, catastrophic failure precisely when the enemy was already practically bled dry? Or are we dealing with a classic manifestation of a psychological archetype that I call the blind player? This archetype is activated at moments when a leader, blinded by the glimmer of imminent historical glory, begins to consciously and systematically filter out any alarming reports that do not fit into his rosy picture of a quick parade. General Świerczewski drove his units forward with a frightening, almost religious obsession. Communication lines stretched for tens of kilometers across the complex, forested, and completely unfamiliar terrain of Saxony. His personal ambitions, a burning, almost physical desire to be among history's chief triumphers and to ride into the vanquished city on a white horse, completely overshadowed the elementary rules of military logic. A strange atmosphere reigned at army headquarters in those days. On the one hand, bravura reports of advancement. On the other, the growing grumbling of supply officers, stacks of unopened telegrams about fuel shortages piled up on the quartermaster's desks, while multi-kilometer traffic jams of Studebaker trucks, their wheels hopelessly stuck in the rich black soil, lined the roads. The gap between the attacking units and their material base did not just become large, it became fatal. Young Polish lads, many of whom had only donned uniforms a few months prior, advanced deep into enemy territory without proper air support, while heavy artillery and supply trains remained far behind, choking in road chaos. And at this very moment, the figure of Ferdinand Schörner appears on the scene. In memoir literature, he is often portrayed as a mad fanatic, throwing the last teenagers and old men into the furnace of war out of a sense of helpless despair. And this is my second fundamental doubt about the established narrative. If we carefully study the movement patterns of his panzer fists, we will see not the agony of a madman, but the icy, mathematically precise calculation of a top-class professional. Schörner did not act at random. Like an experienced predator, he sensed the exact point where the thin, overstretched thread of Polish communications was ready to snap at the slightest touch. He struck like a surgical scalpel, aiming not at the forehead of the advancing columns, but at their soft, unprotected underbelly, at those very stretched-out rear areas where organizational disorder reigned. The German offensive began with such suddenness that Polish divisional headquarters at first simply refused to believe it. In the area of the ancient cities of Bautzen and Weissenberg, absolute tactical chaos reigned within hours. Polish units, lacking experience in confronting massive attacks by heavy armored formations, were instantly cut into small, isolated groups. Wired communication, the Army's delicate nervous system, was severed within the first 15 minutes of the massive shelling. Radios emitted only useless static crackle. German electronic warfare systems worked flawlessly. In the air, besides the smell of burning, there was a specific aroma of decaying luxury. German shells broke open the cellars of local barons, and the smell of old wine mingled with the stench of diesel exhaust and the dust of ruined ancient walls. At this point, it is critically important to conduct a deep analysis of the psychological portrait not only of Svierdczewski, but also of the higher Soviet leadership, observing this scene from distant headquarters. We often hear accusations that Allies were cynically used as a human shield to cover up their own miscalculations. Let's cast aside emotions and look at the essence of the process. Here, the archetype of the ruthless demiurge manifests itself. For a strategic genius whose thoughts are occupied with redrawing the world map, a separate army of an allied state is merely a statistical unit, a resource that can and should be sacrificed for a higher goal. The logic here is frighteningly simple and effective. If, to deliver the final checkmate on the chessboard of history, one must sacrifice a rook or a knight, they will be sacrificed without even batting an eye. And here arises the most inconvenient, most thorny question. Did the High Command know about the concentration of German forces south of Bautzen? Fragments of documents, which today with the greatest difficulty seep through the sieve of secret archives, tell us. There were signals, multiple, alarming, screaming. But they were consciously ignored because the victory schedule did not allow for any delays. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a simple signalman in encircled Bautzen. You have a useless receiver in your hands, outside the window is the clanking of panther tracks, and on your tablet, an order to advance further west when the enemy is already behind you. Write in the comments now how you would feel, realizing that your lives have become mere bargaining chips in a big political game. Your reflections help algorithms spread this video, giving truth a chance to be heard. Meanwhile, the situation on the battlefields transitioned into a state of irreversible collapse. The Second Army was rapidly losing control. Officers on the ground, abandoned without clear instructions, tried to organize a defense in the stone houses of Weissenberg, turning each basement into an improvised fortress. But against heavy artillery and Schörner's experienced crews, they had little chance. The lack of basic necessities, bandages, ammunition, clean water, was already felt by the end of the first day of the counterattack. General Zwierczewski, in his headquarters, according to eyewitnesses, was in a state close to complete mental collapse. His orders, transmitted through surviving communication channels, were fragmented and contradictory. He demanded the impossible: to attack superior enemy forces head-on when his soldiers didn't even have minimal ammunition left. This was not strategy. It was the agony of will, an act of total psychological powerlessness in the face of a reality that refused to submit to his ambitious plans. An interesting detail of microhistory. In those very hours, when the front was collapsing, Zwierczewski's headquarters allegedly tried to organize a celebratory dinner in honor of the imminent capture of Dresden. Expensive porcelain and silver stood on the tables, and flashes of exploding German shells were already visible in the windows. This surreal contrast between imagined triumph and real catastrophe perfectly illustrates the abyss into which the Second Army's command plunged. Few know that in some Polish units, officers, driven to despair by the lack of communication, decided to break through to the east independently, against orders from above, which saved many lives, but was called a manifestation of cowardice and disorganization in official reports. Only when the scale of the catastrophe began to threaten the Soviet rear and supply routes of the Berlin grouping directly, were reserves of the First Ukrainian Front hastily thrown into battle. Official history textbooks for decades presented this as a high act of combat brotherhood and selfless assistance. And in this lies my third, perhaps most bitter doubt. If we overlay the movement schedules of Soviet tank corps onto a map of actual combat operations, we will see an astonishing picture. The saving strikes were delivered precisely at the moment when German wedges approached the main highways along which the main forces of Zhukov and Konev were supplied. Helping Polish units was not the goal, but merely a side effect of protecting their own strategic interests. Cold pragmatism dictated the logic of actions. It was necessary to save not an ally, but their own chances for an unhindered capture of Berlin. The tragedy near Bautzen and Weissenberg became one of the bloodiest pages in the final act of that war. A huge number of young lives who saw the world through the sights of their rifles and dreamed of returning home to liberated Poland were cut short in that cold Saxon mud. The losses were so grand that the Second Army practically ceased to exist as a unified combat mechanism for several weeks. Thousands missing, hundreds of burned tanks, mountains of abandoned equipment. Such was the price of the Berlin race and the personal ambitions of the General Staff. In post-war Poland, this event was long preferred to be silenced or presented in a highly truncated, retouched form, fearing to cast a shadow on the impeccability of the Allied command's strategic planning. But what does this story tell us today in the era of digital technologies and instant information transfer? Why does the Bautzen-Weissenberg drama remain relevant? It is a cruel, unvarnished lesson about how dangerous it is to be in an informational vacuum created by one's own arrogance. It is a story about how easily living people can be turned into abstract numbers on a map if your goal is not the defense of values, but a place on history's pedestal. We see here a universal mechanism for triggering catastrophes, which still works today. Ignoring inconvenient facts, a lack of feedback between leadership and implementers, and, of course, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a beautiful television picture or political rating. In our world, the behavioral patterns of leaders change extremely slowly. The archetypes of the blind player and the ruthless demiurge still determine the destinies of millions. The genuine truth, as then, hides in the smallest details. In an unheard specialist's report, in empty warehouses that are full on paper, in the eyes of those who are forced to correct others' mistakes at the cost of their own lives. When we look at modern conflicts, we often see the same dizziness from success and the same willingness to hide tactical failures behind grandiose speeches. Concluding our audit of this dark page of the past, I again return to the image of the general with his silver watch on the foggy morning of April 20th. Those watches were ticking not just time until the attack, they were ticking the sunset of an era in which human life could be so easily and cynically sacrificed for operational speed. We are obliged to remember these events not to reopen old wounds, but to learn to recognize the same lies in the present. True history is never smooth and pleasant. It always smells of burning, blood, and bitter truth, which those who are accustomed to drawing only victorious arrows on maps fears so much. By studying such paradoxical, tragic, and deeply human moments, we take a step towards ensuring that in the future, the hands on history's clock will no longer show the time of the beginning of another senseless catastrophe caused by someone's vanity and deafness to reality. The Battle of Bautzen is not just an Allied defeat. It is a symbol of what happens when truth becomes the first casualty in the pursuit of glory. And even if the fog over the Saxon fields has long dissipated, the shadows of those events still remind us. Behind every great triumph, there is always an invisible queue of those whose voices were deliberately silenced for the triumphant salvos of a salute. To remember this means to respect not only the past, but also our right to an honest future, where human lives will always weigh more than any geopolitical ambitions. In this story, there are no unequivocal heroes and villains, but only a complex, painful process of the clash of human wills and systems, where truth often finds itself caught between a hammer and an anvil. And our task as researchers is not to pass a final judgment, but to learn to see these hidden mechanisms, so that one day we might break this vicious cycle of repeating the same mistakes. For history, as is known, teaches nothing except that its lessons are too costly to those who refuse to learn them in time. April 20th, 1945 will forever remain in memory as the day when spring in Saxony was stained with the colors of unjustified losses and shattered hopes. And though Sverchevsky's silver clock stopped long ago, its echo can still be heard in archives, in memoirs, and in the hearts of those who seek the true meaning behind the facade of official myths. We will continue to seek these answers, peel back layers of gilding, and face the facts, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. For only in this way can we truly understand who we are and where we are heading in this endless flow of time. General Sverchevsky ultimately met his end far from those battlefields, but the shadow of Bautzen haunted him until the very end. History does not forgive those who play with human destinies like pawns, and oblivion is merely the mildest form of its punishment. We, however, choose to remember, analyze, and doubt, because it is in doubt that understanding is born, and in understanding lies our only defense against the repetition of past tragedies. Let this story serve as a reminder that the true strength of a military leader lies not in the ability to drive people forward, but in the wisdom to stop in time and listen to the voice of reality, even if that voice sounds quieter than the triumphant marches of victory. The Saxon towns of Bautzen and Weissenberg today live peaceful lives. Their streets are clean and their houses restored. But if one looks closely at the old masonry of some buildings, traces of shrapnel can still be found, small, almost imperceptible scars of a great war. These scars are like our memory. They may heal, but they will never completely disappear. And as long as we talk about this, as long as we seek truth in the fog of the past, those who remained in the mud of 45 are not forgotten. Their story continues in our search, in our questions, and in our desire never again to allow ambition to blind the minds of those entrusted with human lives. With this, we conclude our deep audit for today. It has been a difficult journey into the heart of one of the most suppressed catastrophes of the war's end. If you have listened to this point, it means that you care about authentic, unvarnished history. Thank you for being with me in this investigation. See you in new episodes where we will continue to unmask the past and seek answers to the most complex questions of our time. Peace to your home and clear skies above your head. Would you like me to prepare a similarly deep psychological and tactical analysis of the fall of Königsberg? Or perhaps you are more interested in the behind-the-scenes games of the Tehran Conference? Write your opinion in the comments, and together we will choose the topic for the next big investigation. Your participation is what gives life to this project. Stay in touch, because history is much closer and more complex than it seems. In conclusion, I would like to add just one detail that often escapes the gaze of researchers. Years later, when passions had subsided, one of the surviving participants of those events recalled that the most terrible thing in those days was not the roar of cannons, but the silence that followed the battle. A silence in which the ticking of those very clocks, measuring time in a world that had changed forever, could be distinctly heard. Let this ticking be a reminder to us of the value of every second and every life in this fragile and unpredictable world. End of transmission.